Hello and welcome to LSAT Logic Applied. I'm your host, Andrew Leahy, an assistant teaching professor of law at Drexel Klein School of Law. This is a short format podcast where I take the tools from LSAT logical reasoning, assumptions, flaws, causation, strength and weaken, and apply them to real-world claims in the news, science, and public discourse. For those that don't know, the LSAT is the law school admission test, a standardized exam designed to assess logical reasoning, analytical thinking, and reading comprehension for law school applicants. It's a high-stakes test with unique focus on how arguments work and how they fall apart. The LSAT is owned and administered by the Law School Admission Council, or LSAC. I don't claim any affiliation or ownership. I'm just here to teach the logic. You don't need to be studying for the LSAT to follow along. The point is to learn how to spot weak or incomplete reasoning in everyday life. The same kind of reasoning the LSAT trains you to attack under time pressure. Today's episode looks at the search for life beyond Earth and asks a very LSAT-style question. When does evidence that is consistent with life become evidence for life? Here's the background. When NASA scientists opened the sample return canister from the OSIRIS-REx mission, they found material from the asteroid Bennu that contained many of life's chemical building blocks. The sample included all 5 nucleobases used in DNA and RNA, many amino acids found in proteins, and a rich collection of organic molecules. That sounds extraordinary, and it is. For decades, scientists have thought that asteroids may have delivered some of the ingredients of life to early Earth. So when an asteroid sample contains amino acids, nucleobases, and other organic compounds, it is tempting to hear that as something close to NASA found evidence of life. But that is exactly where the logic gets tricky. The Bennu sample contained chemistry that life uses, but it did not show that life existed there. In fact, one of the interesting findings was that the amino acids were split almost evenly between left-handed and right-handed forms. On Earth, biology overwhelmingly uses left-handed amino acids. If Bennu had shown a strong left-handed preference, scientists might have inferred that life's molecular asymmetry was inherited from space. Instead, the near-even split suggests that this asymmetry probably emerged later through processes on Earth. That raises a larger question for astrobiology. How do scientists detect life when they don't know in advance what alien life would even look like? A new framework called LifeTracer tries to answer that question. Instead of searching for one magic molecule that proves biology, it looks at full chemical patterns. It asks whether a complex mixture of molecules looks more like known biological material or more like non-living chemistry from meteorites. The implicit argument looks something like this. Life produces distinctive chemical patterns. Non-living chemistry produces different chemical patterns. A machine learning system can be trained to distinguish those patterns, and therefore, when we examine samples from asteroids, Mars, or ocean worlds, pattern-based tools may help us identify whether the chemistry is more likely biological or abiotic. That is a careful and interesting claim, but it is also an argument with assumptions, and that makes it perfect for the LSAT. So let's break down the claim. The structure of the argument looks roughly like this. Asteroid samples can contain many of life's building blocks. The presence of those building blocks alone does not prove life. Traditional biosignatures like amino acids, lipids, or chirality may be too narrow because they are based on Earth life. LifeTracer examines broader molecular patterns rather than relying on one specific molecule. Therefore, a full pattern approach may be better suited to distinguishing life from non-life in extraterrestrial samples. Now, that is a much better argument than the simplistic version of we found organic molecules, so we found life. The article, which is linked in the show notes, is actually warning against that mistake. But the LifeTracer claim still depends on a series of inferences. It depends on the idea that life and non-life leave meaningfully different chemical fingerprints. It depends on the idea that those fingerprints survive in samples. It depends on the idea that a model trained on Earth materials and meteorites can help classify materials from places like Mars, Europa, or Io. None of those assumptions are crazy, but they are assumptions, and on the LSAT, that is where the work begins. So let's start with necessary versus sufficient conditions. Life's ingredients are not life. Start with the most important logical distinction, necessary versus sufficient. Life as we know it may require organic molecules. It may use amino acids. It may depend on nucleobases. It may require complex carbon chemistry. But it does not follow that wherever we find those ingredients, we have found life. That is the classic necessary versus sufficient flaw. Oxygen may be necessary for a fire, but finding oxygen does not prove there was a fire. Flour may be necessary for bread, but finding flour does not prove someone baked bread. Amino acids may be necessary for life as we know it, but finding amino acids does not prove life existed. The Bennu sample is useful precisely because it dramatizes that distinction. It contains familiar biological ingredients, but the better inference is not, oh, so there must be life there. The better inference is life-friendly chemistry may be widespread. That is a much narrower conclusion, and narrowing the conclusion is often what good reasoning requires. The second LSAT issue is the false positive problem. A false positive occurs when evidence points toward a conclusion, but does not actually establish it. In medical testing, a false positive says you have a condition when you do not. In criminal law, a false positive might mean evidence wrongly implicates a suspect. In astrobiology, a false positive means non living chemistry looks biological, and that is the danger here. If non living asteroids can produce rich mixtures of organic molecules, then the mere presence of those molecules cannot be treated as decisive. The evidence is relevant, but not conclusive. This is a subtle but important LSAT point. Evidence can support a hypothesis without proving that hypothesis. On the LSAT, students sometimes overread evidence. They see that a fact is consistent with a conclusion and treat that fact as though it establishes the conclusion. But lots of facts are consistent with multiple explanations. Organic molecules in an asteroid sample are consistent with the possibility that life's ingredients came from space. They're also consistent with non living chemical processes that produce complex organic compounds. So the question becomes comparative. Which explanation does the evidence support more strongly? And that is where the reasoning gets more sophisticated. The next LSAT lens is causation. When we find molecules associated with life, there are at least two possible causal stories. One story is biological, life produced the molecules. The other is prebiotic or abiotic. Non-living chemistry produced the molecules, and those molecules later became useful for life. Those are very different causal claims. The Bennu story points toward the second one. The asteroid may have carried ingredients that could eventually contribute to life, but that does not mean life generated those ingredients. On the LSAT, this is a common causal flaw, confusing a condition that helps produce an outcome with evidence that the outcome already occurred. If rain helps plants grow, finding rainwater does not prove there were plants. If organic chemistry helps life emerge, finding organic chemistry does not prove life emerged. The direction of causation matters. Did biology produce the chemistry, or did chemistry create some of the conditions that later made biology possible? Those are not the same claim. The next issue is one of assumptions. Traditional biosignatures often look for features associated with Earth life, certain amino acids, certain lipid structures, certain chiral preferences, and certain carbon-based patterns. That makes sense. Earth life is the only life we know, but it also creates a bias. If alien life is chemically similar to Earth life, those indicators may work very well. But if alien life is different, then an Earth-centered approach could miss it. That would be a false negative. At the same time, if non-living chemistry can imitate some Earth-like features, then an Earth-centered approach could also misidentify non-life as life. That would be a false positive. So the argument has a dilemma. If we define life too narrowly, we may miss unfamiliar life. If we define life too broadly, we may mistake chemistry for biology. That is a very LSAT-style tension. The harder problem is not whether evidence matters, it is how much the evidence supports given alternative explanations. LifeTracer tries to solve this by moving away from single molecules and toward overall chemical patterns. That is a promising move, but it does not eliminate the underlying assumption. It still assumes that life, even unfamiliar life, leaves a detectively different kind of chemical order than non-life. That may be true, but it is not self-proving. And LifeTracer uses supervised machine learning. That means it trains on examples where the answer is already known. In this case, researchers use meteorite samples as examples of abiotic chemistry and terrestrial soil and sediment samples as examples containing degraded biological material. Then the model learns to distinguish those two groups. That creates a classification argument. These known biotic samples have one kind of chemical pattern. These known abiotic samples have another kind of chemical pattern. An unknown sample resembles one group more than the other. Therefore, the unknown sample may be more likely biotic or abiotic. This is essentially an argument by analogy. And like all analogies, it depends on whether the comparison set is representative. Here, the LSAT question is, are meteorites and Earth soils a good enough training set for samples from Mars, Phobos, Deimos, Europa, or Enceladus? Maybe they're a useful start, but they're not the same environments. The model is trained on a limited number of samples. The biotic category comes from Earth. The abiotic category comes from meteorites. Future samples may contain mixed histories, degraded molecules, contamination, or chemical pathways not well represented in the training data. That does not make LifeTracer useless, it just means the conclusion should be cautious. The strongest version is not LifeTracer can detect alien life. The stronger and more defensible version is LifeTracer may help assess whether complex organic mixtures resemble known biological or non-biological patterns. That narrower conclusion fits the evidence much better. The article also uses a powerful idea. Life produces molecules with purpose, while non-living chemistry does not. That is a compelling distinction. Cells store energy, build membranes, transmit information, and reproduce. Biology is shaped by metabolism and evolution. Non-living chemistry is not. But the word purpose can be tricky. On the LSAT, you would ask, what does purpose mean in measurable chemical terms? If purpose means that molecules are organized in ways shaped by selection, metabolism, and biological function, then it may be a useful shorthand. But if purpose becomes too vague, it risks smuggling in the conclusion. We may look at a complex chemical pattern, call it purposeful, and then infer life because it seems purposeful. That would be circular. So the concept needs operational boundaries. What chemical features count as evidence of biological organization? How do we distinguish biological organization from non-living complexity? How much complexity is enough complexity? The LifeTracer approach is interesting because it tries to answer those questions empirically by looking at patterns across entire mixtures, but the logic still depends on drawing a defensible line between organized chemistry and biological chemistry. So what's missing here? How would we boost or bust this argument? To strengthen the argument, we'd want to know several things. First, we'd want a larger and more diverse training set. 18 samples may be enough to show proof of concept, but is not enough to establish a universal life detection method. More meteorites, more Earth environments, more degraded biological samples, and more extreme environments would make the model more persuasive. Second, we'd want to know whether LifeTracer can correctly classify difficult borderline cases. The easy cases matter less. The real test is whether the system can handle samples that mix biological and abiotic chemistry, samples that have been chemically altered over time, or samples that contain unfamiliar organic compounds. Third, we would want independent validation. Can the model classify samples it has never seen before? Can other labs reproduce the results? Does it work across different instruments and extraction methods? Fourth, we would want a clear account of what a model is actually detecting. If LifeTracer says one sample looks biotic, is that because of a meaningful biological pattern or because of some artifact of sample preparation, preservation, contamination, or instrument bias? And fifth and finally, we would want to know how the model performs when the target is not Earth life. That is the hardest question. If the model is trained on Earth-based biology, then its ability to detect truly unfamiliar alien biology remains entirely uncertain. On the other hand, the argument would be weakened if the model performs well only on the original sample set but poorly on new samples. If the supposed biotic markers turn out to reflect Earth contamination or sample preparation artifacts, if abiotic chemistry under different planetary conditions can produce the same full pattern signatures, or if the distinction between biotic and abiotic samples depends too heavily on Earth-specific biology. In other words, the key issue is not whether LifeTracer is interesting. It definitely is. The key issue is whether the evidence supports the broad claim that we are moving toward detecting life without knowing what it looks like, or the narrower claim that we have a promising new way to classify complex organic mixtures. Those are entirely different conclusions, and the narrower one is much stronger, even if it makes for less exciting reporting. This episode is really about one of the most important LSAT lessons. Evidence can be relevant without being sufficient. The Bennu sample is exciting because it contains life's building blocks, but life's building blocks are not life. They are consistent with life. They may help explain how life could emerge, but they do not prove that biology was present. That distinction matters far beyond astrobiology. In everyday reasoning, we constantly encounter evidence that points in a direction but does not get us all the way to the conclusion. A symptom is not a diagnosis. A motive is not proof of guilt. A correlation is not causation. A necessary condition is not a sufficient condition, and life, like chemistry, is not life itself. The deeper question is how to reason under uncertainty. LifeTracer represents a more sophisticated approach because it does not look for a single magic molecule. It looks for patterns. It asks whether the whole chemical landscape looks more like biology or more like non-living geochemistry. That is good reasoning, but still not conclusive reasoning. So the LSAT questions are we confusing necessary conditions with sufficient ones? Are we treating evidence consistent with life as evidence proving life? Are we accounting for alternative explanations? Is our classification system built on a representative comparison set? And are we searching for life in general, or just life that resembles Earth? Because in science, as on the LSAT, the most dangerous inference is often the one that feels almost right. Amino acids matter, nucleobases matter, organic chemistry matters, but the conclusion has to match the evidence. Life's ingredients are not life, and recognizing that difference may be the first step toward actually finding it. And with that, I thank you for listening to LSAT Logic Applied. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more short episodes where we apply clean logic to messy, real-world claims. See you next time.